Never in my life would I have thought that I would be talking to you from the inside of a Mustang that happens to be electric and a crossover, but life is full of surprises, so here we are in the 2021 Ford Mustang Mach-E. Now, while the Mach-E may not entirely drive like the Mustangs that you and I are used to, I have to admit, I am pretty darn impressed with this thing. Now, most variants of Mustang do a pretty commendable job offering a balanced handling experience with the power to overwhelm the rear end in a hurry when you want it. But things are a little bit different here in the Mach-E, despite some impressive power figures. Take, for example, my first edition tester here. We're dealing with about 332 horsepower and 417 pound-feet of torque, and those numbers aren't really anything to sneeze at, but with Ford-driven wheels and the powertrain's bulk about as literally as low as it can be, it takes an awful amount of work to unsettle this thing. Now, the Mach-E is still pretty fun to chuck into corners thanks to that low center of gravity, in addition to things like nicely weighted steering and that instantaneous electronic torque, but it's not really a tail-happy maniac like you assume most Mustangs can be, or in some cases are. Although I imagine the GT and rear-wheel drive trim should kind of shake that cup up a little bit. Honestly, it's not an outright sports car in this trim, but comes closer than anything else in the segment. Now, the fixed dampers on my first edition trim are actually surprisingly soft, giving a bit more body roll in the corners than I would probably say I'd like, but it's still more on the composed side than on the outright soft side. It doesn't feel like a filled fish tank or anything. Some appreciative stiffness would probably bolster that Mustang connection a bit better, but sadly, if you want the cool magnetorheological adaptive dampers, you're stuck springing for the expensive GT trim. The Mach-E's instant-on electric torque does make for some exciting starts, but I wouldn't exactly call this brutal or anything that you normally hear associated with EVs. Smash the accelerator from a stop, and I do get pushed back into my seat, but it's never really overwhelming. And in more normal driving situations, there is a good amount of throttle manipulation, so you can kind of roll onto it as you get out of the corner for a nice, smooth exit. Now, the GT is going to be more of the proper bullet, so if you're looking for something that's kind of hard-edged, that's the trim to go for. The performance of this all-wheel drive model, I would say, is probably a bit more akin to the Mustang EcoBoost. It's plenty of power for most people, but it's not exactly the end-all be-all. In the Mach-E, 3 different vehicle modes are available. Whisper, as you can imagine, prioritizes smoothness with a numbed accelerator that's more reluctant to accumulate speed, in addition to a little bit looser of a steering feel. In the middle of the road, we have Engage, which kind of sharpens everything up a bit, but the top mode, Unbridled, really sharpens things up even further. Given the suspension's preference for smoothness, honestly, I think Whisper's my preferred mode. No matter the mode you're in, the Mach-E also includes a fun little replacement for the engine note that you are probably missing. That increases in intensity as you ramp up the accelerator and as you change vehicle modes. You know, it's just a fun little touch, doesn't really do anything, but it's kind of a nice little thing to have, especially when most EVs just have that low speed noise meant for pedestrians. It's the fun things, you know? Like most EVs, regenerative braking is along for the ride here in the Mach-E, and it's pretty darn good. There's a setting that enables one-pedal driving, and to be honest, whether I'm on the highway or country roads, I have almost not had to even touch the left side pedal. Sadly, when I do, it's not my favorite. There is a pretty obvious change in deceleration rate between the regenerative and the friction brakes, and I really hope Ford smooths that out with the GT, because I have to imagine that'll be the one owners will be chucking in the corners the most. Now, my time with the Mach-E is sadly on the limited side, so I haven't been able to give it a full range rundown, so let's just kind of go through some numbers. The EPA rates this first edition variant here with all-wheel drive at about 270 miles, thanks to its larger 98.8 kilowatt-hour battery. Sadly though, getting into this thing on a chilly late November morning, my range is showing a little bit closer to 220. And now that the snow has picked up and everything, it's kind of dipping even lower than that. And when it comes time to charge, the Mach-E will accept up to 150 kilowatts of juice, which is pretty darn quick. That'll give it a charge time of 10 to 80%, about 38 to 45 minutes depending on your battery size. But once again, my experience was a little more tepid than that. I went to a local EVgo charger, which promises up to 50 kilowatts of juice, about a third of the max power. However, I was only able to get about 35 out of it, so in about 45 to 50 minutes, I only managed about 18 kilowatt hours to top off. While we're sitting here juicing up, let's talk tech. We'll start small. Well, small-ish with the 10.2-inch digital gauge display. Now it's pretty straightforward and really only gives you the information you need. By default, you have what gear you're in, the range, and your speed, and that's about it. If you turn on lane change assist, everything kind of shuffles to the side while a little car appears in the middle and lets you know with colors when you're going to deviate out of the lane. Turn on turn-by-turn directions as well, and everything once again kind of shuffles over and you get the next turn displayed on there too. Now it's all super straightforward and easy to suss out even while you're at speed because turning the features on and off really doesn't move stuff around too much. That brings us to the meat and potatoes, this honkin' 15.5-inch portrait display running Ford's Sync 4 infotainment system. Now if you're familiar with later iterations of Sync, this one should act as second nature, albeit with some minor changes for the shape of the display and the fact that we're in the Mach-E. But even newbies should find it pretty easy to suss out too. The entire top half is dedicated to basically one setting, whether it's your map or your audio, and you have these little tiles underneath so you can kind of swap between the two depending on what you want to manipulate. On the bottom half of the screen you have your HVAC controls along with a cool knurled integrated volume knob here. Now no matter what I'm clicking, the display is responsive and everything is sized so that distracting hyper precision isn't really necessary when you're driving. Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and Waze integration are all standard, as is a 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspot through AT&T. Now my absolute favorite bit of this infotainment system, and I know this will sound super weird, is the settings menu. Click the little Mach-E at the top left here, and you get a litany of things to change, whether you want to engage various vehicle modes or turn driver aids on and off. But that's not the cool part. The cool part are these little I buttons to the right here. You know how when you get into a new car, all the settings kind of seem nebulous and with some marketing terms, you're not entirely sure what some of those settings actually do? Well, Ford's figured out a solution. Just click a little I here on the right side of whatever setting you have, and all of a sudden, boom, a straightforward, no-nonsense explanation of what it does. I mean, honestly, it's brilliant. In addition to the wireless charger in the center console, USB ports abound. Both rows of the Mach-E receive one USB-A and one USB-C port. So unless you're rolling 5 people deep and they all have red battery indicators, you should be plenty fine on juice. Now whereas coupes like the regular Mustang are kind of cramped on the inside and they have to really squeeze every inch of usability out of what little space is actually in there, well, the Mach-E feels like chilling in a concert hall by comparison. It is super roomy in here, aided in part by a glass roof up above and, you know, a near total lack of mechanical bits below. Now even with the windshield that's a little on the short side and a rear glass that's even a little more scrunched, this is still a light and airy place to be with plenty of visibility where it counts. Now I am an absolute sucker for fabric interior trim, so I was geeked to find it here on the Mach-E. Not only does it adorn pretty much the entire width of the dashboard, it does double duty on the door panels where it hides some potent B&O speakers. It's a warm, fuzzier kind of complement to the colder, harder plastics that I find here on the A-pillar and a little bit lower on the door panel. Hopefully, because this is a pre-production prototype, those plastics will soften up because, in my opinion, they're not really befitting of a $45,000 car. But on the whole, this is a great complement to an otherwise kind of straightforward, simple dashboard design. Now, since there isn't a transmission or a drive shaft to worry about, there is an absolute boatload of space in this thing for storing just about whatever you need. Up front here underneath the infotainment, we have not one but 2 tiers of storage, with the top tray containing a wireless device charger. You flip up the center armrest, you have more than enough space in this cubby for a purse or gloves or mask, what have you. And in the door cards, we have more cup holders and more space, believe it or not. And the trunk's pretty good too. Despite the cut roofline out back, it is a surprisingly deep trunk, more than enough to hold, say, a family's worth of groceries or weekender bags. Now, comfort absolutely abounds in the Mach-E. The front leather seats here are supportive without being tight, but it's really the back row that caught my attention the most. You know, given the shape of the roofline, I kind of thought there'd be a little bit of issue getting tall people back there, but my awkward 6-foot Gumby frame has no issues with head or legroom. I mean, heck, the Mach-E's wide enough to where riding 3 abreast shouldn't be much of an issue. You know, I'd cram 3 people back there to show you, but, you know, the thing. Now, perhaps my cynicism about the whole Mustang connection thing is a little overblown, at least where style is concerned. The Mach-E does have Mustang influences all over, and something tells me that when the next generation Stang comes out in a year or two, there will be even tighter connections. We'll start up here in the front, with some pretty cool looking headlights, but the grille is where most of the tenuous Mustang connection comes in. although I guess you can't really call this one much of a grill. Sure, the little mustachioed bit around the end pulls in air, and you get some extra airflow down here thanks to the active grill shutters, but on the whole, it might not be too Mustang, but still looks pretty darn good. Now the real connections start as you work your way back here with a cut roofline that is, well, coupe over-ish as can be, along with some fat rear fenders that I think would be at home on any two-door sports car. But the real bit of fraternal twinning comes right here at the taillights. You've got the traditional Mustang triple stack taillights, although on the Mach-E, they've grown these new kind of protuberances that bring the rear end together a little bit and makes it seem a little less 2C thick than it would otherwise. So if the Mach-E isn't really much of a Mustang, then what is it? Well, with prices ranging between $43,000 and this first edition tester here coming in at about $60,000, and given the way it drives, I'd call it more of a sensible EV that airs towards grand touring rather than sport. Ford likely has more hardcore stuff in store for the upcoming GT. As it stands, this Mach-E would be great for road trips or regular daily use in a way that most Mustangs aren't, and its real-world range should keep folks pretty content. Honestly, the 2021 Ford Mustang Mach-E sets a fantastic baseline, not only for cars in this segment, but for all of Ford's future EVs in general.